Yeah, this meeting's being recorded and will be uploaded to YouTube. So if that disturbs you with regard to privacy, your option is to drop off.
All right, welcome everybody. This is the bi-weekly SIG VMware meeting. Today is April 18, 2019, and as always, we're off with the community updates from Steve.
Okay, just a minute. I'm renaming myself in Zoom. Okay, community updates. We'll start with a recap of Slack activity because I know that not everybody can keep up with what's going on there, and going back and searching and things is rough. There is a user trying to making an inquiry about backing up a Kubernetes storage class with multiple data stores. And Miles recommended that he instead switch over to using storage policy-based management tags. But that led to a further inquiry as to whether that actually works, because there's apparently an issue open on that. And the issue may be restricted to use cases where your Kubernetes worker node straddles multiple vSphere clusters. And there's been activity on that issue as recently as 3 days ago. I don't see the names of anybody who's active in it. I was hoping that if somebody joined the call, like Michael or somebody who seems to be active on that issue, maybe they could add a little more color on that. But looking at the list, is anybody here familiar with that issue? If not, I think we'll just move on, because I don't think anybody in today's meeting can add much to that, but be advised that this is going on. Okay, let's move on. There was yet another, I think this must be the third time this has come up, but somebody who got that deprecation warning running the in-tree provider, concerned that they had something misconfigured or had to do something. And I would suggest that the next time somebody goes and touch it, we rebuild the in-tree plugin, that we maybe add a little bit more to that deprecation warning, explaining to people that for now you're okay and that there's nothing to worry about, because it's apparent that people see that and are concerned that something may be going horribly wrong. And it could be the wording on that was just a little too aggressive, since this I believe is the third person who was disturbed enough that they came out on Slack to ask about it.
I think it's doing its job. I'm just kidding. I think that CLI option, like at first it was a generic description that applied to all the cloud providers, but I think DIMS added a way to customize a message per provider. So like we can open a PR and make it a little bit more descriptive if we wanted.
Yeah. Yeah, I think if we just explain that, hey, maybe even give a link or something saying, yeah, here's what's going on in the move out of tree. There's nothing you need to do right now, but, you know, be advised that sometime in, say, the next year, that you're going to have to go out of tree. And whether that's a year or 6 months, whatever it is, let's put a little more description into that, because if people keep coming to Slack, it tells me that that message needs improvement. Okay, let's move on. Finally, there's a user experiencing...
Sorry, I just wanted to ask a question to Andrew about this specifically. I'm thinking that, you know, the confusion from users around the messaging around deprecation of cloud providers is possibly because there's no like clear user-facing document that explains what's going on. You know, there's a lot of, you know, SIG-related documentation. There's a lot of like CAPs and so on, but there's nothing like user-oriented type of, you know, web page or something that tells, hey, you know, there's a shift coming. You know, we're going out of tree. In-tree is going to be deprecated. That's why you see this message, by the way. And, you know, expect to see more of, you know, these type of messages, and potentially at some point in time you will see that, you know, the in-tree cloud providers are gone, so you will not be able to just use the cloud provider equal vSphere anymore, and so on and so forth. So I wonder if there's anything like that. I mean, I'm not aware of any document like that. And it will be interesting to propose, I don't know, to SIG docs, to SIG cloud provider, to build something like this. Not provider specific, but more like, generically speaking, as a process in the whole Kubernetes core.
Yeah, I agree. I think the original intention, okay, so like first we said, oh, let's add it in docs, but then it was hard to do that because we don't have a good foundation for the cloud provider docs to build on top of. So I think we shifted and said, let's add that detail in the KEPs, and let's keep our KEPs, like our KEP should be detailed, but then like the proposal part of the KEP, or like the kind of like the high level section of the KEP should clearly indicate what the changes are going to look like, and then we can just point users to the KEPs. I don't know if that's a good approach. What do you think?
I don't know. I'm just thinking that sometimes when I point people, and this it's anecdotally based on my experience with with folks that I interacted with that had inquired about in general cloud provider, right? What's going on with cloud providers? Why I'm seeing this deprecation notice and blah blah blah. And I point them to the KEP, and they just don't find an easy way to consume the KEP.
Well, users won't even know what a KEP is. They're not, KEPs aren't written for a user audience, in my opinion. So I just posted a thing on the chat to a suggestion. So this is in the Kubernetes docs, and it's the generic, and it's the first thing that comes up on a Google search, by the way, for cloud provider and Kubernetes. And it's an itemized list of all the cloud providers, but how about if we submit a PR to this doc, this page, putting a little deprecation warning explanation right on top before that list of specific cloud providers? That seems like a decent home for this. And then in our warning message, we could simply give a link to this.
So we could. This page is, like, if you go through it, it's just a dumping ground of random information. And it is still, like, I don't think we put it here because it can be confused with the cloud provider integration being deprecated, but that's not necessarily true. Like, the cloud provider integration should be, it still exists, it's just the way it's configured. And so I think the ideal situation was that the documentation that each cloud provider implements, it should have a section that says like, hey, like, this is the plan, this is the timeline. These are the generic configurations on the components that you change. And there are also changes to, like, specific changes only for this cloud provider that needs to be updated as well.
Right. So I think
ideally you need to delegate
a paragraph just explaining that cloud providers in general are moving out of tree. For the specifics, you have to see below, but just put the paragraph right at the top of this page. And I mean, I don't see any harm in submitting the PR. They could turn it down, but we could start.
I actually agree with Andrew on this. This document here is not, I don't think it's meant to like illustrate how the cloud providers, are, not illustrate how do we transition from in tree to out of tree.
Okay, well then you need to explain what the alternate is then.
Yeah, here's the thing. So we do have, the problem is coming from the deprecation notice that we have in the log files, right? So the log files are filled up with deprecation notice from the cloud provider. So people get scared and they reach out to Slack saying, hey, what is happening, right? So I think what is missing here is a user-facing page that is like a deprecation notice of something. Like it's the same thing.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but is this the closest thing to a user-facing page on cloud provider? Because the KEP isn't made for users.
I don't want to point them to a KEP. I don't want to point them to this page. I want to point them to a page that serves only one purpose, which is this is the cloud provider deprecation notice, and eventually that page can point to all the other cloud providers and their own timelines. I don't care, as long as users are aware that the transition is happening, and when it will happen in tree, cloud provider will not be there anymore. So they will have to find out where the other external cloud providers are living for their own platform.
So I have I added to the end of the agenda. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, as a consumer, enterprise speaker, as a consumer of that, we know that there is a deprecation. What is really hard for us to find is when this is going to happen, when I can start consuming the new out of tree providers, and especially with this relationship between the out of tree and the CSI, right? Because they are somewhat related. So we don't have a clear understanding, not just for vSphere, for all the providers, when we can start consuming the out of tree, when they are going to be GA. This is what, it really confuses me. And this is why, I try to, ping Travis, Fabio, every single month, just asking, hey, what's going on, right? To me, this is
so I added to the end of the agenda some of the work I'm doing with docs. And so how do we feel about, so for action item, we should get, docs improved in the 115 timeline. And then for 115, we can have a dedicated page for the vSphere docs just for deprecation. And we can link that back to the CLI warning. And then we can kind of take the lead and have other providers follow us in that.
Yeah, and Farhan, I hope I'm pronouncing your name right. You can correct me if not. The answer about when this is going to occur is very likely to be different for each cloud provider because they all have dev teams working on this. So in the main Kubernetes docs, I think they're going to have to delegate that. And even that, as software goes, people aspire to a certain date, and reality is often that you don't quite hit it, and there's going to be an overlap period. There already is one now where if you want to live on kind of the leading edge, you can go to the out of tree right now today, but it probably isn't production worthy. I think it's fair to say that if anybody on this call working on it thinks it's ready to go to release, correct me, but I think we've been labeling it alpha. When that goes to release, I don't know. That my gut feel, but it's just a gut feel, is I'd aspire to end of year, but I don't know if anybody wants to go right in the doc a specific date.
I don't think
we're adding a deprecation note, and we don't know when we need to switch. It scares me like hell, right? Because when I see that deprecation, I need to move, but I cannot move because it's not yet GA.
Yeah, I'd say the earliest you might want to use for production is when the out of tree gets a release label, and that hasn't happened yet. And I don't think Fabio, you're kind of the project lead on that, right? What do you think? What's your gut feel on the earliest that do you think the out of tree would get moved from alpha to beta and then to release?
So that gets into the next session of the call, which I want to get to. But
okay.
Yeah, I mean,
so we'll let you talk about it.
Short answer to your question is that the cloud provider is going to be beta very, very soon, and it's already can be considered beta already. The problem with that is that it requires CSI to perform a complete move from in-tree to out-of-tree.
Right. And
there's also some work upstream where migrating HA clusters is a little complicated, and we're also doing work upstream to make that safer. So it'll depend on that too.
And technically, I think by Kubernetes standards, we're on the hook to come up with a migration plan too, not just that, you use out of tree for new ones, but if you happen to already have a system installed and in production on the old one, we can't expect people to have to tear it down and bring up a whole new Kubernetes cluster side by side to pull this off.
There's some degrees of support to that, but I don't.
I'm not mistaken. You and I, in fact, have to do a deck on that very subject for KubeCon China. So,
yeah.
Anybody interested in that subject? Fabio and I don't have our deck ready yet, but it will have to be by third week of June because we're going to be presenting a session on that subject. So we'll have it figured out by then, I hope.
Do you want to continue with the updates?
Sure. So finally, the last Slack update, there was a user having gRPC connection problems while trying to use the vSphere CSI driver with RBAC. And that one seems to be people discussing this issue up till like the last 48 hours. And I do see David's on the call as well as Travis. Do you have anything to add on this, on what might be going on?
Not too much to add other than it's not gRPC. It's all access control. The gRPC connections are working the way they should. But yeah, I mean, I have not recreated this myself. Every time I've walked through the instructions that he followed, they've worked. So it is something to look into. I mean, I would consider this a real issue to figure out why or what is different about his cluster that these roles aren't working the way they should. So this is, he asked if he should file an issue. I asked him to politely wait a couple days for reasons that are going to come up later because the CSI repo is about to move. But yeah, I would consider this an open issue for sure.
One of the things I used to do when I did vSphere backup was suggest this is obviously not a full working solution, but just in case it's a lacking permission to tell people to try it with full admin just to see if it goes away. Now, you don't want to live that way permanently, but at least it gives you a clue that maybe there's just one missing permission and figure out what that might be. On the other hand, if they go full admin and it looks exactly the same, then you've eliminated that as a...
And actually, Steve, I don't know if anybody's noticed, but the user you're talking about has just joined the call recently. I recognized the screen name. So yeah, but yeah, I think we have to try and recreate it and see if there's something specific about that user's cluster. I don't know if he wants to say anything or not, but probably at least be happy to know that we're talking about it.
Are you talking about my, this is Alex James. Are you talking about my issue with the CSI node RBAC issue?
Yes,
in fact, we are.
Oh, all right. I joined at the right time.
Yeah, yeah. I just noticed
you missed the first
showed up.
minute of the conversation, even. But
but what
yeah,
what I will mention on my environment is I did, so it was originally Kubernetes 1.13 some minor version, I can't remember. And it was working then, and I did an upgrade to 1.14, and I didn't notice that it broke at that point, but that is, I know it was after that point that I noticed it was broken. So what I've done to try and fix it was I figured I'd just start fresh, and I just did a kubectl delete on all the YAML files for the whole thing, and then just started fresh from the tutorial, and that's where I ran into that error. So it's possible there's something still out there in my cluster that might just be a bad configuration just hidden somewhere, but I'm not sure where to go look for it.
Okay, well that's extremely useful information to know that it happened after it was upgraded from 1.13 to 1.14. So that gives us something more to try and track that down. Thank you.
actually, just to clarify,
I'm in here. The 1.14, I believe that's where they added in the CRDs for the storage stuff, like natively. And so if that's the case, then yeah, we'll need to take a look at it. But you might not have to apply the CRD YAML file that we provide, and then yeah, I'd have to take a look at it. If those things are actually natively, the CRDs are natively there, you wouldn't have to apply it. It should work unless, like you said, there are some additional permission issues in 1.14.
But they say you will.
Okay.
Well,
and then one thing I had posted in the Slack is I did notice that as of 1.14 that they, I guess, were introducing that you now have to explicitly set some roles and permissions for custom resources. So I don't know if that had an effect changing from 1.13 to 1.14 either, but just another thing to mention.
Okay, that's really useful. I mean, and obviously, we know that there are differences around some of that area in 1.14, and I don't think we've explored that fully and especially documented what needs to be done differently. So that's definitely an action item for us to figure that out.
Yeah, I definitely haven't tried 1.14 yet.
Don't say that. Yeah, that's something we got to do really soon.
okay, well,
I'm
thanks.
glad you guys talked about this. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah,
we're not going to fully resolve these issues in these meetings. If you want to come back for meetings in the future,
of course.
but we do try to at least get them moving forward and get status reports. So thanks for joining in. Finally, the last community item I've got is KubeCon Europe, which will occur in about a month. We've still got one more meeting before it, but I just wanted to give people a heads up that they have a provision for pre-events to hold face-to-face meetings for SIGs. And Fabio went and applied and got granted a meeting room for this. We'll see how many people show up, but conceivably this meeting could be used for both talks where developers get together as well as users getting together with other users and the developers on the parts of Kubernetes that intersect VMware infrastructure. This will be considered a separate event, apparently. It just came up at the Kubernetes community meeting, which occurs an hour before this one. So they mentioned that it will require a separate registration, that just having a KubeCon badge isn't the same as getting into this community event. And nobody brought it up, but I believe that also means that if you don't have a pass for the full KubeCon, but if you're local to the area, maybe you could come just for the face-to-face meeting if you'd get value out of that. So we don't have specifics as to the room or the time yet, but when the next VMware SIG meeting happens in 2 weeks, I expect we'll have further details. That's it for community, so I'll turn it over to Fabio and Andrew to talk about SIG folding.
Yeah, I just added this last minute, so unfortunately, I put Andrew's name in there as well. So I don't know if we want to talk about this since you're chair of SIG cloud provider, but just give it like a brief overview of what's going on there, and maybe Andrew, if you want to add more, you can jump on at any time. So we had this proposal out, proposal that was created and initiated by Nishi Davidson from SIG AWS, around folding some of the more platform or cloud provider specific SIGs, such as AWS, GCP, OpenStack, VMware, IBM Cloud, and so on. And this proposal has been discussed in front of the steering committee, I think a week or two ago. And the proposal was accepted. So we're moving forward with the plan. And the plan, the TLDR of the plan is basically all the sub-projects that are currently part of all these SIGs will be transitioned under a SIG cloud provider, unless there is another SIG sponsoring any of those sub-projects. An example will be Cluster API, for example. Cluster API sub-projects for the providers are hosted under SIG cluster lifecycle. So CSI, cloud provider itself, and all the other sub-projects that all the other SIGs have will be transitioned under SIG cloud provider in the coming months. So we don't have like a specific timeline yet, but the time box is possibly to do this between now and when KubeCon North America CFP will close, which is still TBD. But we suppose it's going to be sometime around end of June or first or second week of July. So what does that mean? That means that this call specifically will probably cease to happen. We're going to have specific calls for all the various sub-projects. So cloud provider will have one. CSI vSphere will probably have a different one that we don't have yet. The Cluster API call for vSphere, we're going to keep that as usual on every other Monday. And we're going to basically transition all those sub-projects under the various other overarching SIGs. So this meeting will go away. We will not have SIG VMware anymore, and we will probably transition SIG VMware as a whole into a user group. And the user group will be more user-focused instead of being developer-focused. So things like resolving issues, helping customers, helping end users will be the top priority. And again, this is still TBD because the charter for the user groups is not like set in stone yet, but we've seen some movement around, and we expect to to see more progress during and after the KubeCons that are happening in the coming months.
And I would expect that we will have a meeting for this user group, the VMware user group, as well as a session at KubeCon events.
Yep. So there's in the proposal that I will put the link to the proposal in the meeting notes. In the proposal, we specifically asked to keep representation of all these sub-projects in terms of interest groups that are of people that are developers and users that are interested in a specific platform. So we will probably have a formalized way of getting a session at all the KubeCons that has to do with the specific platform or cloud provider that we're interested in. And we're gonna, again, after the user group will be formalized and we're gonna have a VMware user group, then we're definitely gonna have a meeting that is gonna be, with maybe a bi-weekly, maybe a monthly, we don't know yet, but it's gonna be more focused on the user stories than, the development of what's going on with the various, efforts, the active project update that we usually do.
Yeah, so the user group discussion and proposal is actually gaining a lot of traction, and Damini, who's leading it, I believe the proposal is like the high level ideas are kind of set already, and she is looking for early adopters, and so I believe the requirement is 2 chairs for the user group, and then 2 additional interested users who would back up the user group. I don't think we'll have a problem getting that for VMware. So if folks here want to be early adopters or want to be a chair of the user group and you don't have to wait for the SIG to fold to start the user group. You can start the user group now and then kind of transition the SIG into sub-projects slower. But if we want to be early adopters, now would be a good time to speak up and say that.
Yeah, I think maybe we should go for it. Is there a document or some recorded meeting that describes this? Because I wasn't aware of that. If you've got something, if you can cut and paste it into the meeting notes for today, that would be great.
Yeah, I'll do that. There's a mailing list. I'll link it there.
Okay. Yeah, maybe I'll try to join that mailing list then.
Yeah, that was I wanted to get this in front of the SIG as quickly as possible because it is a pretty big change, and it's not going to happen soon. Like as in we're still going to have the next meeting and probably the next one and the one after as well. So it's not something that will change dramatically our schedule right now, but it will change in the in the short term. So active projects update. So we have we've been working on the split of cloud provider vSphere and CSI vSphere for a couple of weeks now, and Travis has done some work. Travis, do you want to give an update on that?
Yeah, this is almost done, even though you can't actually see it. So the answer here is that the repo under Kubernetes SIGs is created. I have already taken the CSI code and I have it ready to push to that repo and make it stand alone, but I don't have write access to the repo yet. There's just the one thing that needs to happen is the GitHub team needs to be assigned to the repo that's created, and that hasn't happened yet. Once that does happen, I will do one kind of administrative push that pushes the code to populate that repo, and then we'll move to normal PR only mode. But I have that push ready. I just need write access. I'm ready to open a PR to the cloud provider CCM repo that removes CSI. I have a PR ready to open that points the Kubernetes CSI docs to the new repo location. All of that's waiting on my write access. But yeah, I mean, that's basically it. A couple follow-up things that will need to happen after that is created is putting in, I'll reach out to Andrew Kutz, who isn't on the call today, but working on like the PROW integration. Everything that was being called before is pretty easy to call again, but the step that I don't know how to do is what configuration it takes that has like the secret credentials once the images are built to push them up into GCR, how to configure that and where those come from. But Andrew knows those details. That's the only thing I don't know right now. And that's basically it. So as soon as I get write access to that repo, CSI will no longer be in the cloud provider repo. So I'm pretty happy about that. And it went really fast. Like you said, it was 2 weeks, but I think we went 2 weeks from this meeting exactly to ready to make that happen. So I'm pretty happy with that turnaround time.
Yeah, it turns out that if all the meetings align as they should, everything gets done pretty quickly. Just want to add one more thing on that. So people will probably remember that we were currently blocking any new releases on the cloud provider and CSI because of this move. So this move is happening, possibly, by next week it will be done. So we plan to have, definitely a cloud provider version being tagged, possibly a beta version of the cloud provider. And I'm not sure if we're planning to do a second alpha release of CSI at the same time, but we're probably not going to tag a beta version of CSI in the very short term, but definitely we're going to have a CCM ready as we reached parity with Intri. So the current CCM state is in pretty good shape. So we want to have a release out.
Yeah, and I can add a little bit there. On the CSI front, I do intend to tag a second alpha release for CSI. It probably won't be the exact same day that you do the cloud controller, but we won't be declaring it beta until some additional functionality comes in and the driver is maintained by the storage business unit. So there's more stuff coming there, and the time frame that I expect that to happen is more, I think, around May. So that's probably 6 weeks out, but that'll be up to them and when they declare that. And then, at that point, when that storage plugin is considered GA, it will also be controlled by SAB, the storage business unit.
Sounds good. Awesome. And that's pretty much it for cluster, cloud provider, and CSI. I do have a small update on Cluster API. So I think last time we talked about the V1 Alpha 1 release that we had. The V1 Alpha 1 release was done in concert with all the other Cluster API providers and the main Cluster API repo. There's been a lot of work on Cluster API in general in this past 4 or 5 weeks. A lot of discussion happening on the design of Cluster API itself. So again, if you're interested in Cluster API in general, and not just for vSphere, but also if you're interested in Cluster API for vSphere, and you want to participate in the design phase of Cluster API, this is the right time to join SIG Cluster Lifecycle and follow the Cluster API threads that are happening there, because it's really in move. The time is right now if you want to make an impact on that. For Cluster API provider vSphere, we do have a small update. Loke and I have been working on an old PR of mine that I had opened a few months back, actually before, I think it was late 2018 actually. So it's been a long time, to add support for ESX hosts. So currently Cluster API provider vSphere only works when it's connected to a vCenter. So it requires an API surface that is not available directly on the bare ESX host. And this is proven to be problematic for development mostly. So this is obviously not something we want to support as a use case for production, but it's definitely something that will make our life much, much easier when it comes to developing on Cluster API. So we are, Loke has picked up my old PR that has been sitting there for a while. He made some changes. He fixed some bugs, and he, most of it was basically rebasing the entire thing on the new code base, which was, was actually an impressive feat. There's a lot of changes that have happened in the past 6 months, and looks like it's in working condition now. And he's probably going to push that out pretty soon, hopefully, before the end of next week. So once that is merged, we're going to have support for ESX hosts. So you can just run, your ESX host on a local virtual machine and run Cluster API against it, which is much, much easier than just having, some random vSphere environment laying around to just do, some Cluster API development. So that's actually great news for people that are involved in that. And that's pretty much it. That's pretty much it for this week.
Now, one thing to follow up on that, using just a bare ESX, some of those things I think require a whole vCenter anyway, like that issue we discussed on using storage policy-based management, I think can't be done on a bare ESX, right? So I don't think you could actually be a dev and test everything without a vCenter, but if you wanted to do kind of a proof of concept or a learning exercise platform, that should be viable, a home lab.
Yeah, I mean, it's again, I was saying before, it's very useful for development while you're developing on Cluster API. If you're able to test like features directly against the ESX, obviously you cannot test everything, especially features that are not available on a single ESX, obviously. But it's, you know, we do have two things. So one is development, and that's why it's useful. For testing is not that useful because you don't really want to test against a single ESX. For testing, actually, we do have some improvements that are not strictly related to CAPV or Cluster API vSphere, but are mostly around the VCSIM, which is the vCenter simulator, that is adding more support for features like more, or was it less used features of vCenter. So not just like powering up a VM or powering down a VM, and you know the various properties they can collect of the objects in the VM tree, but also things like data store clusters, storage policy-based management, and all the other features that are kind of less explored usually. So that's another good thing. So we're gonna have like a simulator that we can test against when we develop, and we can have a CI signal that is more robust, especially on these features that will require a lot of resources to test with a live environment. And yeah, that's it. We can, unless there's questions on this, we can move on to the open forum. And I see that, Andrew, you have added something.
Yeah, so this is continuing our discussion earlier around docs. So in 115, I am working on adding some more content to the vSphere docs. So this is covering both in-tree and out-of-tree provider. So this is just me requesting early feedback on the structure and outline of the docs. So I posted a PR there that kind of just has the table of contents for what the docs should look like. And so once we can all agree on like the general outline and the table of contents, then we can start delegating work and actually writing those docs. So like the feedback I got earlier from this call is that we want a dedicated page for deprecation notices that we can link out from all the log warnings that we have in the components. But if folks have other feedback they want to add to what headings or what pages we need for the vSphere docs, that'd be great. Miles Gray and I are planning to start writing in May. So preferably if you can provide feedback before that, that'd be great. That's all.
The only thing I'd say, maybe this isn't permanently needed, but right now your table of contents handles in-tree and out-of-tree, and a natural adjunct would be, how do I migrate from in to out?
That's a good point. I will add that section in there. Thanks.
Cool. Thanks, Andrew. All right. Looks like we don't have anything else on the agenda. If there are any questions, we're happy to answer them, or we can get 15 minutes back. It's up to you, folks. All right, going once, twice, 3 times. All right.
Bye, everybody.
See you folks in 2 weeks.